You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we're here to talk about creation. And Paul, this week, it's coming up to St. Patrick's Day.
It is, yes,
yeah.
That's right.
Are you going to get yourself a Shamrock Shake?
Now, we were talking before this episode because, well, first of all, I guess I should say St. Patrick's Day is not a really big thing here in England. Obviously, it is in Ireland. And it is for any Irish that are living here in England. Mm-hmm. But I think it's actually probably a bigger deal for you guys over in the States because of the Irish-American diaspora.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and you were telling me that there's this thing called a Shamrock Milkshake.
Yeah, a Shamrock Shake.
A Shamrock Shake, presumably not made with real shamrocks.
No, presumably not. I hope not. Yeah, it's at McDonald's, right? And I don't know that we should say that. They don't sponsor our video, so don't think that's a ad keyword there, YouTube or other platforms. But anyway, yeah, it's at a local fast food restaurant where you can go, and it's like a green. They take their vanilla shake and then they just add a mild mint flavor and then a little green coloring, and then there you go, a Shamrock Shake. And I'm told this year they've got something with Oreos in it too, that they've sort of expanded their shake line to include these sorts of, I don't know what they are exactly, but cookies and cream stuff or whatever. I don't know. Anyway, it's green and I guess people like it.
Well, I've learned something new anyway.
There you go.
And there's another anniversary this week. It's the anniversary of the birth it's the anniversary of the birth of William Jennings Bryan.
That's true, yes.
Of Scopes Trial fame. And of course, you live in Dayton, Tennessee.
Yes.
Which is where the Scopes Trial happened. So is that a big deal for you in Dayton?
No. No. It's 2 days after St. Patrick's Day. It's March 19. It is... no, it's not a big deal. At Bryan College, which is named after William Jennings Bryan, this is their Heritage Week, so they will have talks about the history of the college and whatnot. But yeah, no, it's not a big deal. The Scopes Trial happened here, and for those folks who might only know it from the movie Inherit the Wind, it's nothing like that. Bryan did not keel over in the courtroom, horrified at the cross-examination that he was enduring and all that nonsense. He actually, they concluded the trial, and then he went to church, and this was the day after he'd been in Chattanooga. This is a really interesting story. We got this story from his driver years later, but apparently he was in Chattanooga the day before arranging for the printing of his final his closing argument that he was going to give. And he was hit by a car. Now, in those days, right, it's the 20s. Nobody's driving really fast, but still, he got knocked over. And then the next day, he dies peacefully in his sleep in the afternoon during his afternoon nap. So, I speculate there might have been some relationship there, blood clot or something that happened and caused him to pass away that day. But no, he didn't pass. He didn't die right there in the middle of the courtroom in a dramatic fashion like the movie shows. So now you know.
There we are. What's the topic for today then?
Oh, Paul. Oh, Paul. Here we go. It's this book by William Lane Craig. It is In Quest of the Historical Adam. Now, we do not have with us Dr. Craig. This is going to be the beginning of a two-part discussion on the book. We're going to talk theology and Bible studies this episode, and the next episode we'll talk about the science. And we'll have special guests each episode. We'll get to that here in a second. But Paul, I just finished reading this book recently. And I can't say that I liked it. So let me give you a little rundown. So the idea that he's putting forward here in the book is that we evangelical believers can get along with evolution just fine, no problem, if we allow for essentially recognizing that Genesis 1 through 11 is written intentionally as a myth and is not intended to be taken as any sort of historical record. And, well, we'll get to that in a second. It's the details are not meant to be historical. Let's put it that way. And then he goes through human evolution and he tries to tell us that maybe Adam and Eve lived 750,000 years ago somewhere. And yeah, so it's a theistic evolution book. It's a book that's basically trying to tell us that we can all have our theology just as we have it, and we can preserve, inerrancy and whatnot, and still accept evolution and be okay with that. Now, Paul, I'm pretty sure that's not your position.
No, it's not my position. So, given that this is a theistic evolution book, and this doesn't represent the position of either of us here on the podcast, why are we talking about it? And is our aim just to kind of do a hatchet job on this book, Todd? Is that what we're planning to do?
Well, let me tell you, there's a fleshly desire in my heart to do quite a hatchet job on this book. But yeah, why should we discuss this? And I guess we're discussing it because it's extremely popular. Dr. Craig is very well known as an apologetics expert. I heard about him when I was a student, and now years later, we're still hearing about him. He's still putting out books, so he's very well known and very influential. And I imagine some of our listeners have seen this book, and they are, wondering what the deal is. Should we read it? And maybe they're young Earth creationists and they don't know exactly what his position is. Although I don't think he's really kept it a secret. So yeah, I thought it would be worthwhile to do this. Now, thinking about this and praying about this, and this is tough because, yeah, like I said, there's a part of me that really disliked the book rather intensely, and I don't want our podcast to just become, as you say, a hatchet job, right? Just come on and beat up people who aren't even here to defend themselves. That seems inappropriate. And I was trying to figure out, how in the world are we going to do this? And what came into my mind as I was thinking and praying about this was very simple. What are the great commandments? Love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus also told us to love your enemy. So even those who are treating you poorly, which we will see is part of Craig's approach. And yeah, so you don't return blow for blow and eye for eye and life for life. You turn the other cheek and you go the extra mile for the people who abuse you and treat you poorly, and you heap burning coals on their head. But ultimately, even if I don't heap burning coals on his head, I'm going to treat Dr. Craig with more respect than he treated me. How about that?
Yeah. Now we should probably just tell our listeners who William Lane Craig is, because I guess some will know because he is a very prominent personality in the Christian world. But I guess some of our listeners might not know who William Lane Craig is. So William Lane Craig is an analytical philosopher. He's a theologian. He's a very well-known Christian apologist. He's particularly known for his debates with atheists and agnostics and others. He has done a lot of research and work, particularly in a couple of areas. One is on what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. and the other is his defense of the resurrection of Jesus. He's the author of many books, including the one, obviously, that we're going to talk about today. Yep. And since 2014, he has been the professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. So he's got a big public profile. He's a very well-known debater and apologist. His books get lots of attention. And so, we thought it was worthwhile just trying to interact with this book a bit.
Yeah. And he also runs that website, Reasonable Faith.
That's correct.
Which may be something that people are pretty familiar with, given that, people share stuff on social media and whatnot. So that's probably where you've encountered him, if you have encountered him somewhere randomly. All right. Well, shall we get to it?
Let's get started.
So this week, to talk about theology, we thought, what we need is a theologian. So we've invited here today to be with us Dr. Hans Madueme. Dr. Madueme is a professor of theology at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And he not only has his doctorate in theology, but he also has a medical degree, an MD. So he has multiple backgrounds that will be relevant to what we're talking about. So, Dr. Madueme, thanks for being with us.
Greetings. It's good to be with you guys today.
It's great to have you with us, Hans. Now, Hans, as I was reading your bio in preparation for today, I saw that you have a very interesting background, because apparently you were born in Sweden, but you grew up in Nigeria and in Austria and in England. Is that right? So could you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I am one of those people that sometimes referred to as third culture people. So I've grown up in lots of places. I'm from everywhere and nowhere. But I was born in Sweden. I only lived there about a year, and then we moved to Nigeria. I'm Nigerian, and we're there until I was about 6 or 7, and then we moved to Austria, and went to school in Vienna. And the reason for those moves, my dad was working as a nuclear physicist, and with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is headquartered in Vienna. And Nigeria was a British colony, and so my parents' generation, my dad's generation, were all about the boarding school experience, and my dad and all his friends went to boarding school. So when I was between age 10 and 17, my dad thought it would be a great idea. It wasn't. I can tell you that at the age of 10, I should go to boarding school in England. So I had the whole British boarding school experience, did GCSEs and A-levels, and so that was the British connection. And then I eventually ended up in Montreal, Quebec, doing an undergrad, and then came to the U.S. for the first time for medical school. And I've been in the U.S. since then.
We should probably just tell people what GCSEs and A-levels are. So
yes, us Americans, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so for the American listeners, basically GCSEs are the exams that you take at the age of 16 when you finish your secondary education. And then you go on after that to do a couple of years usually of A-levels, which you then take at 18, and those are preparation for university. So that's kind of your entrance into university life is based on your A-level results.
Okay. Could you stop then at 16 and just say, I'm not going to take my GCSE and I'm going to go work as a garbage collector or whatever?
Oh yeah, you can take your GCSEs and then finish school and then go off and do something else.
Do whatever.
So school finishes at 16. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. So that's great. That's a really interesting background you've got there, Hans. And I know that this particular topic that we're going to be talking about today, about Adam and the historicity of Adam, is one that you've had a long interest in. In fact, you were one of the editors with Mike Reeves of this book, Adam, the Fall and Original Sin. So obviously this is a topic that you've given a great deal of thought to.
Right.
Bearing in mind, how Todd has kind of set this up, that we do want to kind of look constructively at the book. We're going to critique some aspects of the book, but we do want to be sort of constructive about it. So let's begin. What do you think are some of the positives that you see in William Lane Craig's book? That was a very long question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, no worries. No, I actually think there are a number of positive features to the book. Beginning first, as you all mentioned, he's an analytic philosopher by training. So that just means, at least to my mind, he's just a very clear writer. He writes with the clarity of an analytic philosopher. And that means when he's talking about controversial issues, typically academics, when they're talking about really difficult issues that are controversial, can sometimes find ways to sort of skirt the issues or a kind of ambiguous kind of prose. Craig doesn't have that. I mean, you know exactly what he thinks and you know where he stands. And I think that's just helpful for readers. Another virtue to the book is it's interdisciplinary. So there's an interdisciplinarity to his writing, which, to be honest, just as a professor myself, it's a bit scary just seeing he's a philosopher, but he's dealing with the Old Testament scholarship, he's dealing with New Testament scholarship, and then he's wading into the thick of the sciences, paleoanthropology, paleoneurology, archaeology, and all the rest. It's just very impressive. Most of us are just too scared to do that kind of thing. So I think that's something to his credit. Obviously, Craig he's a brilliant thinker. He has a sharp mind. And as a result, when in the book, you'll see he'll engage with things, I guess they're fads or fashions in academia or in Old Testament scholarship. And he's just not afraid to just go after what he sees as poor argumentation or scholarship. And again, I think there are parts of the book that I found really helpful in that regard. And so he's representing evangelical scholarship. And I think it's significant that he actually thinks there's a historical core to Genesis 1 to 11. Now, obviously, there's going to be things we're going to disagree with, but I think it's worth noting that there are a number of thinkers in the evangelical world that aren't convinced there is a historical core to those early chapters. So I think it's great to have someone of his stature actually defending some kind of historicity to those chapters. Maybe finally, he also believes that all of humanity is descended from a first couple. So at least that's an argument he makes in the book, although there might be some questions we'll raise about that. But he does think Adam and Eve are universal progenitors of the human race, which again is at least in some places, not a fashionable position to take. And the fact that he's defending that in the book, I think, is also admirable. So those are a few sort of pluses, I would say.
Yeah. Now, when we sort of read his book, we realize that he perceives a contrast in literary genre between the first 11 chapters of Genesis and Genesis chapters 12 to 50. And I just wonder if you could sort of tell us a bit about that. What is it that he sees in Genesis 1 to 11 that makes him think that it stands apart from the rest of Genesis? And do you think that he's right about that?
Yeah, so just for our listeners, I mean, that view that Genesis 1 to 11 is distinct from Genesis 12 to 50, that's a fairly common view in academia. So he's not unusual in that regard. And his reasoning is fairly similar. I think in his mind, Genesis 1 to 11, when you read it, it just sort of seems to share the same world as the ancient Near Eastern myths, ancient flood stories or ancient accounts of the culture surrounding Israel. It seems more in that world. Whereas when you compare Genesis 12, starting with Abraham, to Genesis 50, it seems more historical in a way that we would recognize. So I think his main reason is just that it and he goes on to develop that in the book, but just that ancient Near Eastern myths, it seems to share the same world as ancient Near Eastern myths. And I guess, my main reaction to that is just that, one, the late Noah Weeks was someone who I found helpful in this regard. He would question how much we think we know about ancient Near Eastern literature and the ancient Near Eastern world, and that a lot of what Old Testament scholars are saying, a lot of it is kind of speculative, and we seem really confident in terms of what we think we know, and also what the relationship is between the ancient Near Eastern text and the Old Testament. And I sort of share some of his hesitancy in that regard. And as a theologian, I think I appreciate the work of Old Testament scholars about the ancient Near Eastern world, but I think we need to prioritize the canon. We need to prioritize what's in the biblical text first, and then we can see how that might relate to the ancient Near Eastern literature, rather than doing it the other way around. And I do worry that Craig maybe falls into that trap.
Just to clarify for our listeners, when you refer to the ancient Near East, what are we talking about here, Hans?
Well, we're talking about, when I say ancient Near Eastern literature, we're talking about things like the Atrahasis epic, with the Sumerian flood story. These are different sort of founding stories or accounts of ancient peoples, the ways in which they were trying to understand, how did things come to be, talking about gods and how they created. And so there are different accounts that we have, at least, or parts of these accounts that we have, and with ancient people trying to give an origin story. And so then when these were discovered, it's not surprising that people were trying to figure out, well, what's the relationship between these origin stories over here and the biblical origin story? Like, what's the relationship? Did one borrow from the other, etc.?
Yeah. So we're really talking about the literature of ancient Babylonia, Sumeria,
right,
Assyria, Egypt, these kinds of nations
right,
of the ancient Near East.
Right.
Okay. And Craig sort of talks about these sort of family resemblances that he thinks that Genesis 1-11 has with these sort of mythological accounts that we see in the literature of the ancient Near East. Is that right?
That's right.
What are these family resemblances? What is he talking about here?
Yeah, so he has a list of 9 or 10 family resemblances, and I think myths are narratives. Oral or literary narratives was one. Myths are traditional stories handed down from generation to generation. Myths are sacred for the society that embraces them. So these are fairly general kind of concepts, right? Myths are stories in which deities are important characters, and myths sort of exhibit these fantastic elements that aren't really concerned about logical consistency. These kinds of criteria. So he has 9 or 10 of these that scholars, I think there's consensus among Old Testament scholars that when you look at ancient Near Eastern myths, you find these features. So you list these 10, and then part of what he wants to do is to go to Genesis 1-11 to see to what extent does Genesis 1-11 exemplify those same features that we find in these ancient narratives.
And I think that's something that I found really refreshing, let's say that, in his work. Too often I I just hear about the parallels, right? Or someone will say, if you look at Atrahasis, you see these attributes, or if you look at Enuma Elish, that's another one, you'll see this feature. And I've read some of those myths, and they don't read anything like what's in the Bible. There's very little in common with them. And I think this, how can you say this is the same as that? This weird mythology here is the same as what's in the scripture. So an example, I think it's Enuma Elish, where you have the gods are tired of working, and so they create people to do the work for them. And there you go. That's basically what it's for. And it's kind of an afterthought. It's not really like it is in Genesis 1, where we're the sort of crescendo of the week. Where it's really degrading to people, and Craig doesn't. He's kind of skeptical of that, which I thought was good. And then he has these criteria that he wants to use instead, and say, okay, well, if we can show there's enough of these criteria of myths that are present in Genesis 1 through 11, then it stands to reason that we should understand them as mythology rather than as some other genre, which is honestly way better than a lot of other treatments that I've seen among evangelical evangelical scholars trying to wed the Bible to evolution. So I kind of appreciated that, even though, like you say, some of those really almost irrelevant, right? Like his first one, as you said, in myths or narratives. Well, obviously, there lots of things are narratives. That doesn't strike me as a really important criteria.
Right.
Not on the same level as, say, myths have fantastical elements. And that's where I think he spends a lot of time on the idea that Genesis 1 through 11 shows fantastical features. And could you expand on that, Hans?
That you're right. I mean, when you look at the features that he emphasizes as similar between Genesis 1 to 11 and the ancient Near Eastern myths, almost all of them, I would say, I would think on people who hold to the traditional view would accept, that narratives, that traditional stories, they're sacred for the society, etc. So what's really interesting is, like you said, the fantastic elements, and I'm just going to list what he's talking about. So, God created the world in 6 days. The first human beings were vegetarian. There was a snake in Eden who could talk. There were rivers in Eden. There were cherubim with a flaming sword. People before the flood lived a really long time compared to what lifespans today. Noah's flood was global. Linguistic diversity originated from the Tower of Babel, and the earth is only thousands of years old. So in Craig's mind, these are fantastic elements. Craig thinks it's impossible that these things are true. And he also thinks that the biblical author who wrote that into the text likely didn't believe those were historically true as well. Those are, and since Genesis 1 to 11 has those criteria, again, that's another reason for considering them to be mythical, to have the element of myth. And it's fascinating. When I read the book, I was chuckling to myself as I read that section, because I thought, well, that's interesting, because I thought these were straightforwardly historical. I'm not actually sure what the trouble is, but anyway, I mean, this gets at. I mean, obviously, in a post-Enlightenment cultural context, this list includes the kinds of things that people are just inclined to disbelieve. But does Craig offer any sound reasons for thinking these are fantastic in the sense that they didn't happen, that they're not historical, and I wasn't able to find any good reasons?
Yeah. That's a feature that I noticed as well. given that he's an analytic philosopher and he's going through these criteria, I thought, okay, well, he's going to rehearse a few reasons why it is not possible. He'll mention radiometric dating, right? And he'll explain how it works, and he'll tell you how, there's no way. Or he'll mention the starlight and time problem. There's some really easy, basic things that anybody in the creation evolution world kind of knows about and would sort of trot out as the evidences of why you can't believe Genesis is really historical. I didn't find any of that there. It was just kind of open season to make fun of people who do believe that they are historical, and it's just very strange.
or even criteria that arise from within the text itself. That's the kind of the question that was in my mind. What are his criteria for identifying these particular elements of the text as fantastical? Has he got a coherent methodology here? And what it seems to boil down to is, in essence, his personal incredulity about these things.
You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. If you would like more information about what we discussed today, be sure to check out our show notes at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast.
Is Genesis History is the film that is a first step on a journey toward understanding the history of the earth according to Genesis. Follow along with narrator Del Tackett as he travels across the continent with over a dozen scientists and scholars to see fascinating new evidence of creation and a global flood. This film is free to watch on the Is Genesis History YouTube page, along with all the Beyond features which dig deeper into young earth creationism. Be sure to check out the New Creation blog as well, which is sponsored by the film, at newcreation.blog. That's newcreation.blog. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
Now, Craig is really careful here. He wants to say, look, I don't have an anti-supernaturalist bias.
Right. Because he'll accept miracle. That's really bizarre about the whole thing. He'll say certain things are miracles, and so that's not really open to examination. But this is not a miracle, and so it's clearly ludicrous.
Yeah.
It's just very strange.
Yeah, so do we have reasons, Hans, do you think, to be somewhat skeptical of that claim of not having an anti-supernaturalist bias? Because, I guess we have to remember that, Craig is a 21st century man, and he's operating within a context where the dominant kind of paradigm, the dominant worldview is this materialistic scientific worldview.
Right.
And he seems to have a problem with elements in the text that stand in stark contrast when we hold them against that backdrop of the scientific materialist worldview.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of points. Like, one is in the, I forget if it's in the introduction to the book or chapter 1, but early on in the book, he says methodologically, the chapters on biblical and theological themes, he's going to focus on internal questions in the text, and he's going to set aside science. I mean, he actually emphasizes that precisely because he doesn't want to fall into the trap of science sort of coming in through the back door and exercising or shaping the way he interprets scripture. So I appreciated that. But then when we get to the fantastic elements, it seemed to me that the only reason he judges them to be fantastic in the way that he defines them is just because it's not plausible in our sort of scientific mindset or given our cultural assumptions. So I was wondering if he was being consistent to what he set out to do. So that's the first point. And then secondly, in terms of the anti-supernaturalist bias, in terms of, we want to read him charitably. And so as Todd was alluding, he does actually explicitly say, I am not anti-supernaturalist. I believe in miracles, etc. So I want to acknowledge that. But then when one of the fantastic elements that he mentions is the fact that there were cherubim with a flaming sword. So he does actually elaborate on that. And then when you look at the argument he gives, he says it's something to this effect. Well, Israelites would never sort of depict something something from the heavenlies or from the heavens, because they had an explicit commandment from God that they're not supposed to worship heavenly realities. But in the Genesis account, we actually see them depicting cherubim outside the Garden of Eden. So Craig says it must be the case that they didn't believe those were real, because if they believed they were real, then they would have been going against the commandment. So that's something like his reasoning. And I just thought, I was a little surprised, because that just didn't have the same kind of analytic rigor that he has in other parts of the book. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because it doesn't, in Exodus, it's actually what God says is, you're not supposed to worship anything in the heavens, on the earth, or under the earth. So, I mean, it's a pretty universal commandment. But the key is you're not supposed to worship these elements. But there's nothing in the commandment that says you can't depict them, or you can't even sort of create an object for some other purpose other than worship. And, I've interacted with Craig on this, and I pointed out that in Exodus and in First Kings and elsewhere, you see the Israelites physically representing objects and creatures. For instance, in the temple, you have pomegranates, you have the sea being depicted, and you have bulls, like animals being depicted in Solomon's temple. And there's no sense that there was anything wrong with that. And the point is, those weren't worshipped. Whereas when Israelites depicted the golden calf, that was idolatry, because that was in the context of worship. So all of that, all his argumentation for why he thought the cherubim couldn't be historical or literal or real, just actually, upon closer scrutiny, it just didn't seem plausible. And then, which then raises the question, what's really going on here? What's actually motivating this objection? And I think personal incredulity was actually the best answer I could come up with. And I don't say that to be, I don't want to be dismissive of Craig, but it's just hard not to see that as the only viable thing that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. His criteria are not all equally important to identifying mythology. And then the ones that are important, he really doesn't hit with the same analytical clarity that he does with other things. So it does come off as sounding like, I just can't believe this. So it must be mythology, right?
Yeah.
And moving on, just for a second here, because he's got more after this. His understanding of myth, I think, is really important, and I think our listeners really need to understand this, that he's not saying that mythology is something that is just a made-up story, or that it's something that is patently false. He does believe that these are sacred stories that the ancient cultures would believe in to an extent. But because he notes throughout the ancient Near East, you have a host of stories that are mutually contradictory. And they are all sort of compiled together in this sort of mishmash religion of the ancient Near East. That means that the ancient Near Eastern people understood that the truth of their mythology was not found in the literal details. So he specifically mentions, what is the sky and what is the sun, and he talks about, in Egypt you could believe that the sky was sort of a goddess, the body of a goddess. You could believe that it's the underside of a giant celestial cow. So there were these mutually exclusive ideas, and so he infers from that, well, they didn't take them in the same way that we take our stories. that we have this very literalistic mindset and that we want all the details to work out right. And so, but in the ancient Near East, when they had these mutually exclusive stories, then it didn't bother them and so forth. And so, yeah, so he's not denigrating Genesis 1 through 11. He is trying to put it into a cultural context in which he can argue that these unbelievable, fantastical details are in fact part of what it is to be mythology. Of course that's true. That's true of all ancient Near Eastern mythology, and they knew it at the time when they were writing it down. So there's no point in us fussing about all the details because they're not really important. Now, I thought, as I read that, I thought it was really, the ancient Near East comes, and this is a really interesting thing because we have a lot of literature from the ancient Near East from a long period of time. So you can see the development of individual cities as they merge together into these empires. And each city then has its own sort of god and its own sort of mythology. And so I don't think he really appreciates, or at least discusses, just the cultural diversity and the idea that you could have one part of Egypt that believed that the heavens were a goddess and another part of Egypt that believed that the heavens were the underside of a cow, and that, the faithful scribe would write it all down, even though, he knew, well, this probably isn't right, unless I think the goddess is a cow, which I don't think he would. So I think it's important for us to sort of give credit to Craig that he is not here trying to just denigrate the scripture, even though he seems to denigrate, my view of the scripture. He does not like the idea that we can take this historically. So the second element then, Paul, you want to bring us in on that next element there he has in Genesis 1 through 11? We've sort of alluded to it.
Yeah, so, we've talked about the mythology that he kind of sees, the mythological elements that he sees in Genesis 1 to 11. But he doesn't dismiss Genesis 1 to 11 as wholly mythological. He also sees that there is some kind of historical core in Genesis 1 to 11. And so he introduces this concept of mytho history. This is not an idea that originated with William Lane Craig, as he says in the book, but he thinks it applies to Genesis 1 to 11. So, Hans, what does he mean by mytho history? Could you sort of unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah, I think you were sort of hitting on it. I mean, he wants to say that there is a historical core in Genesis 1 to 11. And one of the main places you see that is in the genealogies. So it seems like the author of Genesis 1 to 11 believed that there were these personages, there were these people, and they were related to each other genealogically. And for Craig, that must be historical. But then, so there's that historical core, but then the way it's presented, it's furnished in the language of myth. So there's a lot of the events and that we read in these accounts, we're not supposed to take those historically, but there's there is this core that's history, and genealogies play a really big role in the Old Testament for Craig. So it ends up kind of being this mishmash or this mix where I'm not sure how to apportion it, but there's this history there, but then a lot of the fat around this historical core is mythical. And so, of course, then that raises the question, Craig, how are we supposed to know which bits are like the historical core and which bits are mythical? And I actually asked him that question when we were at an event, and he doesn't like that question. And I think he pushes back on the question, just to say, well, just because I can't really give you a firm answer to the question doesn't mean the concept of mytho history isn't valid. But but fair enough. But the problem is, at least for me, like in the book, he seems to he spends a long time sort of telling us, these fantastic elements, these are mythic, these are part of the myth, these aren't historical or whatever, these aren't supposed to be interpreted literally, but these are the things that, elsewhere he has a list of things that he thinks are true and we should believe. So he is doing that in the book. So I don't think it's unfair to ask him, well, like, on what basis are you making that distinction? But he doesn't really have a good answer to that. As I recall.
Yeah, so I think in his rejoinder to the participants in that symposium, which was published as part of the Sapientia sort of dialogue, and we can link to that in the show notes. He says, trying to sort out the mythological and the historical elements, it's not like kind of separating out coloured balls, two different types of coloured balls. It's more like coffee and cream, so they're kind of all intimately mixed together, and you can't just sort of separate them out. Right. But again, then I'm kind of confused because, as you say, in the book, he then does want to identify certain elements as mythological elements and other elements as a kind of historical core. Right. So it's almost like he kind of wants to have his cake and eat it. And again, I'm left asking this question about, is there a coherent methodology that's underlying what he's doing?
Yeah. I mean, I guess so just to jump in, I mean, I guess as a creationist, it just seems to me that, like, I think part of the problem is just the very project he's engaged in, and we've seen many scholars try to figure out a way to, like, here's what we know to be true extra-textually based on science, based on our understanding of the modern world. It's in tension with what Genesis 1 to 11 and other parts of scripture saying. We still take the Bible seriously, so let's try and figure out a way to make this work. That project, and we, three of us, we know really bad examples of this, and historically, it like all sorts of people have given a crack at solving this problem, and here Craig is coming along, and he's smarter than most of the people who've tried this. He's given a good crack at it, but I just think that trying to solve that problem itself it's not really solvable, at least from my perspective. I think we just need to go back to some principles of, like, this is God's word, and God's word is authoritative, and epistemology. There are all these foundational things we have to return to clarify why we should accept the way God has given us the narrative. So I think in Craig's defense, I just think what he's trying to do is almost an impossible task, but he gives it a good effort.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think it'd be good to turn to the New Testament, Todd.
Yes, I was just going to say that, because he does have one thing that he thinks is useful for recognizing part of that history. And again, it's a little maddening because he's very quick to, as you say, dismiss certain details, but then other things he thinks, well, it's that way in the New Testament. And again, this is something that I kind of appreciated about him. He was kind of hard on people who just quote the New Testament as support for a creationist perspective. I remember, Paul, we did an episode recently where we did that quite a lot, talked about New Testament treatment and the Old Testament. And I think he would hate that episode. And I think he'd hate it because we didn't go through all the very careful argumentation of why we know the New Testament authors are referencing the Old Testament as historical reality and not just a literary reference, right? So how do we know that when Paul talks about Adam, it's not just like Paul referencing, say, Gandalf or Aslan or something like that, where I could reference what Gandalf did in the Mines of Moria and you would know what I'm talking about, and we would have this cultural understanding that I'm making a literary reference, and no one would think anything of it. I wouldn't have to say, now understand. I understand that he's not real. I don't have to do that. So I think Craig's got an important point here, that we can't just, go around listing New Testament references to the Old Testament and say that this means that they thought it was historical. On the other hand, I thought he was also pretty dismissive of pretty much every New Testament reference to Adam as being literary or at least indistinguishable from a literary reference. And he gets hung up on particularly Romans 5. Hans, can you walk us through that little bit right there?
Yeah, let me back. Now I have to. It's been a while since I read the book. I'm trying to remember, because just to your point, I do think he recognizes one or two clear instances of Adam being referenced in the New Testament that he thinks are clearly historical. But then a number of the others he says are literary. So the distinction he's trying to make is, how do we know when the apostolic reference is merely literary versus actual truth or history? And you summarized it really well, and I guess I'll just say I agree with all of that. I agree with everything Craig is saying, sort of in principle. I just don't know that actually has anything to do with that. Really helps us understand what the apostles are doing when they're making references to Adam in the New Testament. I think so. Just to kind of, I guess, to my own view is, I think when the apostles are referring to Adam in a seemingly illustrative way, they're assuming Adam's historicity. Whereas for Craig, illustrative references probably tell us that that's just merely literary and not historical. I think for the apostles, they might be illustrative, to use Craig's view language, but they're assuming historicity. And then there are other times where the apostles assert Adam's historicity, and for Craig, those are clear. Those do imply that they took Adam to be historical. So I just think the way he's trying to parse, it's a really fine parsing. He's trying to show, most of the time Adam was merely literary. Just a couple of times they meant Adam to be historical. Therefore, we can conclude that the apostles did think Adam was historical. I don't know what to make of that. I mean, I guess thanks. I mean, good. That's good news, But it just seems, like I described, like hair splitting, and I'm not actually sure. It's making it very complicated or overly complicated. But yeah, to the Romans, I guess that was all. I'm trying to dodge this Romans 5 thing because remind me. I'm forgetting what he's.
Well, I mean, the basic idea that I recall from that is that, and as you say, it's been a while since I read this, but the basic concept I think was that because Jesus is said to have come to fix what Adam did, a real person making a real sacrifice doesn't do that for what a fictional character did. Mm-hmm. So that in that sense, those references must necessarily go beyond just the written part of what's in Genesis, right?
I see. I see.
Yeah, I think that was and it was very complicated because he was going through Greek grammar and he was going through, the structure, and he was very microscopic about it. That kind of drove me crazy because he doesn't see original sin in the text there, because Paul in that passage doesn't actually reference the old man or the flesh or any of those concepts that are related to the original sin, right? So because it's not there, then that's not what Paul is talking about, and which I thought was a really like you say, that's a very fine hair to split, and I don't see that making a lot of sense to me. But I think that's how he goes about it. So in the other passages, because the passage doesn't really go beyond what we have written in Genesis, you can't argue that it is not a literary reference. In his analytical fashion, right? So, but there is those one or two handful of passages where there is something more than just what's in that original text, and therefore that must be a historical detail.
I'm not sure, I mean, if you look, if we're guided by the history of interpretation, and if we look at how believers down the ages have understood these passages, this just feels like a novel. Like, these distinctions he's making feel pretty novel, and I'm worried that it's the whole way he's trying to, this mytho history, the framework that he has. It sort of feels like he's bringing that to the New Testament and then trying to show, look, the historicity of Adam is way more complicated than we thought, and he, and I'm just worried that that's not actually there. The apostles didn't share that framework that Craig is trying to bring. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And he also kind of draws this analogy with the way that the New Testament uses non-canonical references. So the way that it draws on, extra biblical literature, and he kind of says, look, if you regard this as more than simply illustrative, then you're kind of committing yourself to believing all these kinds of things that are in non-canonical literature, and he seems very dismissive of that. What would be your response on that, Hans?
Yeah, so that was interesting. So he looks at 2 Peter in particular, and 2 Peter chapter 2, where Peter references Noah as a herald of righteousness, and that phrase herald of righteousness isn't in the Old Testament, but we do find it in Jewish tradition. And then the same 2 Peter references Lot as righteous Lot. And again, that's not in Genesis, but it's in Jewish tradition. And then the last example was in Jude 14-15, where Jude cites First Enoch, which is a pseudepigraphal book. And yet a lot of traditional Christians will read Jude as referencing the historical, Enoch as historical, but First Enoch is not a canonical book. So I think Craig will then say, so he says, if you just go by virtue of citation proves historicity, that's going to cause a lot of problems in those three examples. And my response is, that's a good question. I don't know that there's there's just an easy rejoinder, but it's not clear to me why, or Craig does consider the possibility, well, there's oral tradition, and the oral tradition could preserve, by God's providence, could preserve historically true events that are captured by, for instance, First Enoch. Maybe First Enoch actually received the oral tradition and is preserving something that's historically true. And just developing that idea, Craig is very dismissive of that. And as I recall, I read his reasons for being dismissive of the idea that God preserved these truths in oral tradition that are then preserved for us canonically. And I just think he's too quick to dismiss that, and there are other ways, like he acts like it's a slam dunk, these examples he's giving, but I think there are other ways to account for those features of the text that he doesn't take seriously enough.
Yeah. I thought his treatment of that was sort of like his treatment of the fantastical details, right? Mm-hmm. So he doesn't really go into why the Spirit could not preserve this oral tradition.
Right.
he just says, no, that's unbelievable. Can't believe that. And he just moves on. And
Right.
and yet, at the same time, at the end of his book, he wants you to believe that the Spirit has preserved the oral tradition of the original man and woman and their sin for 750,000 years so that it could be included in the Bible in a mythical form. But that's okay, but not preserving a couple thousand years of stories about Lot, a couple thousand years. So it just struck me as kind of a big double standard there. And to get back to his literary reference argument, I do appreciate the idea of wanting to take care with that. But at the same time, when I make a literary reference to Gandalf or Aslan, you know from the culture what we think of that, right? You can go get a copy of Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia, and you can look in the front cover and you'll read, this is a work of fiction. And you'll understand from the cultural context across the culture that we identify that as a work of fiction. And when you look at what the New Testament authors thought of the Old Testament, that's very different, right? They think of it as essentially the Word of God. People, the prophets did not speak on their own, but they were carried along by the Holy Spirit, and they spoke what they were told, and that the Scripture is God breathed. And so it seems to me a really important ingredient that Craig just sort of leaves out in his zeal to just say, the only sources of information available to Paul are the written texts of the Old Testament and the extra biblical literature, the Jewish literature of the day. And I think he's just left out one really important ingredient, the divine authorship of those texts. Well, I think we've just about run out of time. I do want to thank you, Hans, for joining us on our fun podcast here. I guess to wrap it up with a bow here. We like some of the care that Craig shows, but we still find a lot of his arguments very, very, they just fall short of what he's really trying to do, which is, as you said, very typical, unfortunately. Every time people want to wed the science to the Bible, it just comes off as really kind of unconvincing and incomplete.
This might not be...
Well, anyway.
I was going to just jump in. This might not be true for the scientific part of the book, but I think what we're saying is for the biblical and theological side, I think we would agree with almost all that he affirms, and we reject a lot of what he denies. Because what he affirms ends up being a very stripped down account of what we have in Genesis 1-11. And we would say yes to what he affirms. It's just a whole lot more there.
There's a whole lot more than that, yeah. Yep, I agree. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. You can find out more about our podcast at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. You can contact us, podcast@coresci.org. That will send emails to us. If you want to connect with us through social media, you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on all the major social platforms. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please do leave a like. Click that notification bell, click that subscribe button, so you can be sure to be notified every time there is a new episode or even a new video. If you're listening to us on another platform, an audio platform, please do consider leaving us a review and make sure it's good, so that our podcast that really helps us. That really helps us grow. That really helps us reach more people with the podcast. The podcast is brought to you in part by Core Academy of Science. You can find us at coresci.org/connect. And we are a donor-driven ministry, and we really depend on contributions from listeners like you to keep this podcast coming to you. So if you would consider a donation to Core Academy, we'd appreciate that. You can find out more about that at coresci.org/donate. And Paul, Biblical Creation Trust is our other sponsoring ministry. Tell us about them.
Yes, well, like Core Academy, we are basically funded by donations from ordinary Christians. And if you'd like to help support the work that we do, you can go to our website, which is biblicalcreationtrust.org. And on our homepage, there's a donate button. And if you click on that, it will take you to all of the information about the various ways that you can give. And we do appreciate every single one of you that support us.
Indeed we do. So next time we're going to talk the science of this book, which is a little more up my alley. And we're going to have a special guest, a paleontologist, with us here to talk about hominins and human origins and so forth. And that'll finish up our journey through Craig. So join us here again in 2 weeks' time for that episode.
See you in a fortnight.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.